tying in the faith element, I went to BC High in BC, and the Jesuits kind of ignited the set the world aflame mentality into us. You have to fight for justice. So just, Reverend Walker, when did you kind of first get driven into community organizing, and when did you feel inspired to fight for justice or fight against injustices?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, my dear brother. I want to backtrack just for a second. What started the seeds of community engagement was planted in me during my formative years in the faith. So after I joined the Deliverance Evangelistic Church, I was immediately drawn to the outreach team because I had found some joy, and I had found I found out about this beautiful gift of salvation, and I wanted to share it with others. And fortunately, the church had a very robust community engagement team, a prison community engagement team. So essentially, where I started this concern for the community was right at the Deliverance Evangelistic Church. Mm-hmm. I would go out onto the street corners and pass out tracts with their evangelism team and tell people about the gospel, the good news in bad times, and that the Lord loves them. And then eventually that evolved into prison ministry and going once a month for about 3 years to the prisons on State Road in Philadelphia, to a detention center where folks were held awaiting trial. So what I didn't know in the overall the overall picture of things is that these were the seeds that would then begin to germinate and bring me to community organizing, which I'll get to in a second. But little did I know that because I was just trying to replicate the ministry that I saw and what I read in the Bible, that Jesus was going and healing the sick, healing the oppressed, and delivering the captives, and really speaking life to people's dead situations. In fact, and we'll jump into this a little bit later, I know, but when I looked at the model, the example that Jesus set, what I saw was someone who set up health clinics everywhere he went and healed all those who were oppressed. So essentially, Jesus subscribed to universal health care without charging leopards copay. That's interesting and we have politicians who are against universal health care, but yet who swear on the Bible to uphold the principles of the Bible, but we can jump into that a little bit later. But essentially, after spending a few years on the community engagement team, and this is the trajectory here, I then go back to college. So at this time, I got what we call saved at 18. Then took a few years off, and then I went to Penn State, where I majored in organizational leadership and minored in psychology. And then it was there that I became the president of the Christian Club on campus, and we began to hold services and invite the campus to these Christian services. And for those that don't know, Penn State has over 20 campuses in the Commonwealth. So I wasn't at the main campus. I was at one of the ones closer to the Philadelphia area in Abington, Pennsylvania. So eventually we go when we complete the undergrad process there, and as I began to come up to Massachusetts and apply to various applying to various grad schools, BU made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And then I come up here, and my first year I lived in Worcester. So I ended up working for a city councilor, and I began to develop more community organizing skills. I was going to community meetings and meeting with constituents in her district, and having conversations with everyday people, real life people, hearing about real life issues and struggles, and then I would bring it back to the councilwoman, and we would have a dialogue to discuss how can we figure out a solution for this particular problem that a constituent in her district was facing. So essentially, my concern for community engagement started way back in 2005 and just has evolved into many different phases and stages to where we are here now in 2019, where I'm, by the grace of God, still able to do community organizing in certain forms and have organized in many different capacities, but essentially what piqued and sparked my interest in community organizing is the model that I saw in the Bible with the Jesus ministry, because Jesus was a pretty good organizer. And I want to highlight one particular story. There's a story that talks about Jesus feeding the 5,000, and I'm sure you know this, Reverend, that Jesus feeding 5,000 and 5,000 men, not including women and children. So potentially there may be 15,000 people, hypothetically. So that takes a great level of organization because Jesus had 12 disciples. So that in and of itself, I think in that particular instance, shows interest in organizing people, because after they were organized, they sit down, they had a wonderful fish fry. They had some good fish. They had fish and loaves, and really what the story I think is tailored. The story is tailored to teach us that we can do a lot with little if we're faithful.
So let's bring you to Boston.
Let's come to Boston.
And you're in Boston,
Yes, sir.
and one of the things that I'm so impressed by was your commitment to working with people in Pine Street and homeless people and people experiencing some of the most difficult disruptions and so forth.
Sure.
This is an experience, as you know, that a lot of people have no idea what it's like, and particularly more affluent people or white people, they don't have that sense of what is actually happening. So could you tell us a little bit about that street ministry, and then we're going to move into some of the other extraordinary things you've done. We're moving into the section of today, what's about, but let's just back up a little bit and look at that street ministry. What did you learn? What surprised you, and what did you take away from
And
that?
one extra
please.
layer to that is, what about homelessness do people not understand? Why isn't it being discussed? Just some clarity for people that see it as a separate issue from them, but there's homeless all around us, and it's a big issue that we need to understand.
Yes, thank you for that. So after graduation, I completed my graduate studies at Boston University in 2016. I then applied to the Pine Street Inn and worked on their night outreach team. So essentially, for those that may not know, we would go around the streets and we would find brothers and sisters without a home who were hungry, because in this van we had sandwiches, waters, crackers, and soup.
And you were out at what time at night?
From about 9:30 p.m. to about 4:30 a.m. And I worked there for a little over a year. So essentially, and I saw the 4 different seasons and how people who are without a home, who are chronically homeless, respond to weather emergencies and extreme cold, extreme heat wave. So essentially, I had the opportunity to work with a group of folks on the night team, and the purpose was to engage brothers and sisters without a home who felt isolated, forlorn, forgotten, felt like systems have failed them, felt like society has failed them, and sometimes felt like God has failed them, even though our specific mission wasn't to proselytize, but yet and still, when moments arose, I was able to share some good news of God's love with brothers and sisters without a home. So essentially, I had the opportunity to work with Jim O'Connell. He has a book out, Emerging from the Shadows. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. So he is one of the founders of Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. So he's been doing it since went to Harvard Medical School. He's been doing it. He helped actually start street outreach with a night street outreach in the 80s. So he's been doing it for quite some time, almost as long as I've been born. So I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Jim O'Connell and others, and I saw firsthand how it's go get folks and go connect with folks where they are. And for me, this is an evolved form, at that particular time, this is an evolved form of community engagement, but a different audience. So essentially, what I like folks to understand about homelessness is that homelessness doesn't exist in a vacuum. Sometimes there are overlapping issues with it that subsist and that coexist, such as substance abuse or substance dependency and or mental health issues. From Pine Street, I then went on to work with the Boston Rescue Mission, which is a Christian-driven mission that also serves the homeless, but is more intentional about connecting gospel work with the work of working with the homeless. More intentional and explicit about connecting the gospel work to restoring lives. Then I also had the opportunity to work with Bridge Over Troubled Water, which was working as a case manager, working with troubled youth who had become homelessness. And as you said, Bob, it is a major disruption in one's life when one wakes up and they don't have a roof over their head, when one wakes up and they don't have access to food, when one wakes up and they don't have access to gainful employment. So it is a major disruption in one's life. But through those experiences, and there are many stories to share with that, but if I were to sum those three experiences up in one thing that I was encouraged is in the power of resiliency. Because I had the opportunity of working with folks who were chronically homeless and who have been homeless for quite some time. And in some cases, when I met them, they were despondent and depressed. But through a process of helping them apply through being their case manager and helping apply through BHA housing, which is BHA is Boston Public Housing, and other subsidized housing, we were able to get the ball rolling to say that your life doesn't end here. That we can help you bounce back and move forward if you're willing to commit.
So one of the things I'm struck by is I'm assuming that starting with the first responsibility, but you learned where folks tended to be.
Yes, yes.
So you would know there's a community here and a community there. You knew where they moved when the weather changed.
Yes.
And I assume that you built up some relationships so you would see someone who you recognized, they would recognize you.
Yes.
And so it was, in a way, the opposite of the way so many people, which is homeless people are nameless, they're invisible, we don't connect with them as human beings, you refer to them as brothers and sisters. Most people, that's the farthest definition from their mind, that this is, so bringing that humanity to the connection seems to be something that I wish we could all find a way to do that, but you had that very, very deep connection, and which are both involved helping them physically, but also offering some spiritual perspective. So that sounds like that was very moving.
Yes, and what really drove my work and my passion to be concerned about the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the least of these is two things. One, Luke 4:18, where Jesus opened proclamation, he says that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, to heal the sick, to set at liberty them which are bruised, to preach deliverance to the captives, and so forth. And also, this dwelling idea that resides in me that we're all made in the imago Dei. We're all made in God's image. No matter how difficult the circumstance may be, no matter how troubling the situation may be, we are all the imago Dei, made in God's image. And for me, that's what driven a lot of my work so far, particularly that phase of life, and still drives the work I do now, or blessed to do now, is that people should be treated with respect, with dignity, and with love, regardless of what their sexual orientation is, regardless of what their economical situation is, regardless of what their living situation is, because fundamentally, at the core of who they are, they're made in the image and the likeness of God. And for that, they are part of the human family. And, I grew up in a family that had this guiding ethos and ethics that if one is suffering, let the village help.
This is Tom, it just seems this is a perfect transition to talk about Vernon's experience with personally, and then you move to structures. The Poor People's Campaign.
Yes, sir.
The economics that creates this.
Yes.
And all of the other issues. So let's move into And I want to hear what you were going to ask. I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
An ethos that's emerged from this show is the concept of solidarity. That we're all in this together, we're all humans, and we should strive more to work together towards a common collective and common goal. And but they're still discouraging that we seem to be blaming poor people for their own structural, their problems. We keep going back to that instead of looking at the structural situations that created this situation that we're in. So I'm curious, what drew you into the Poor People's Campaign? What can you explain to our audience, the values of the Poor People's Campaign and the overall mission?
Yes, so the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, was rebirthed in 2017 by the Reverend Dr. William Barber and the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, who are national co-chairs. The Poor People's Campaign exists in about 40 different states in this country currently, but it's a rebirth of Dr. Martin Luther King's vision. And towards the last year of his life, he starts to become more radical and bold and speak out against militarism, poverty, and racism. In fact, on April 4th, 1967, in his speech at Riverside Church, he condemned these structures, and he condemns in strong terms the government sending people to fight in Vietnam for freedom, liberation, and justice, while here domestically there's injustice, there's bondage, and there's hatred of the other. So essentially, so that was the original Poor People's Campaign, and unfortunately, as many of us know, Dr. King's life ended at the bullet, at the assassin's bullet, but the mission didn't end. The man died, but the movement didn't stop.
I just remember, if I don't have this exactly right, but he was saying things like, I didn't mean to fight for people to have the right to eat a hamburger and then not be able to afford one.
Yes.
So, that get to that lunch counter, sit in, but still facing, get to the lunch counter and then still fundamental barriers to progress.
That's right, that's right. And so funny you mentioned that, because I had the other thought that he said, what good is it to integrate at a table if you can't afford a cup of coffee?
There we go. That's probably the better quote.
No. But, you're right on line.
Yeah. So I was very struck, you kind of mentioned it quickly, but you're calling for a moral revival.
Yes.
So what does that mean? What do you, I believe in that too, but what is it that Dr. Barber and you and so many people here in Boston are pushing to see?
Well, unfortunately, we find ourselves in very difficult days. We have hatred dominating the news cycles. We have hatred of black and brown bodies that are circulating in the news cycle, and we have white supremacy on the rise. We have a xenophobia on the rise. So this is a very difficult time. And the moral revival is a sense that we need a deep change in this country. And if we look at history, brothers, America never changes in a vacuum, but only through a moral critique of existing systemic inequalities, then change comes. We see that with the abolitionist movement with Frederick Douglass and white abolitionists and white Quakers and William Lloyd Garrison. They all bounded together and said that enough is enough, and we need to fight for freedom, and we need to abolish slavery. So essentially what had drawn, and we see it with the civil rights movement, we see it with the women's suffrage movement, what essentially galvanized and attracted me to the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is that the heart of America needs to be redeemed. It's dark right now, and it's filled with ugliness, but I'm one of those folks who look at the glass half full, while subsequently realizing that the glass is half empty. So to me, it's all based in perspective, based on perspective. We have 140 million people who are poor in this country, and according to the Institute of Policy Study. So essentially, this is atrocious. This is a travesty. And I think that in order for a radical and bold change to come, it will not just come from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It will not just come from Beacon Hill here in Boston, where the State House is located, but it comes when folks from the community get together and join hands, black, white, and brown, religious and non-religious, get together and say that we got to do something about the conditions of our country, because if we don't do anything about the conditions of our country, then the heart of America will not be redeemed. And essentially that's what King was advocating and agitating for. That's what this current Poor People's Campaign is advocating and agitating for. And quite recently, I had the opportunity to stand in solidarity with the Teachers Union on the Fund Our Future. So for those who don't know, the Fund Our Future is consisted of two bills, the Promise Act and the Cherish Act. And to really quickly give a summary about this, the Promise Act, if it passes, would give more money to school districts across the state of Massachusetts to offer services for English as second language learners, for children who require special services or special ed services, special education services, to renovate some of dilapidated and decrepit buildings. And this is what our children need. And there's a coalition across the state of people of goodwill who are saying that our children's education cannot be on the altar of sacrifice, because if it is, then we are headed for a world of trouble, and society is heading for, and particularly American society, North American society, or the United States society is heading into a crippling condition. So essentially, I find it peace and a joy to stand in solidarity with folks who are advocating and agitating for social and radical change. So the Poor People's Campaign quickly galvanizes, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, galvanizes around 5 points. Racism, militarism, the change in the moral narrative, distorted narrative, economical injustice, and ecological devastation. So these are points that the Poor People's Campaign today galvanizes around to say that we can't hurt our planet anymore with climate injustice. We have to do something about these 140 million people who are suffering from the crippling and damaging effects of poverty. And we have to be able to help them achieve the American dream, because we know that education is the way forward. And so the Fund Our Future, coming back to the Fund Our Future, one is the Promise Act, the other is the Cherish Act. The Cherish Act will simply make educational, prevent education increases or tuition increases at state universities here in Massachusetts, therefore trying to keep it affordable for students in the Commonwealth.